So our pastors, John and Krishan, have done a really good job taking us through the book of Hebrews. We've learned a lot about the history and the culture of the times. We've learned about the theme of Hebrews being the sufficiency of Christ's sacrificial atonement. We've explored his role as our only mediator and how he sacrificed his life for our sin once and for all, and how his work on the cross restores our broken relationship with God. And now we've come to chapter 12. The text starts off by likening or comparing the Christian life to a runner running in a race. And you're going to hear from two elite athletes this morning. Now, I am not one of them. But we can consider them additional witnesses, just like we heard from the cloud of witnesses that we talked about in chapter 11 last Sunday. The first person I want to introduce you to this morning is my niece, Kim. Kim is a 31-year-old professional athlete. She's a trainer, competes at the elite level in CrossFit. And in this video from a couple months ago, she is lifting 250 pounds. Yeah, she's awesome. The second person you will hear from this morning, although you won't hear, I'm going to read his words to you because he's off in Austria or somewhere snowboarding, but is my friend Joe. Joe is an amputee. He lost his foot due to an illness several years ago, but he's also a Paralympian snowboarder. He took home a silver medal in the 2022 World Cup. And I asked Kim and Joe for their perspectives about competing in a race as the start of chapter 12 describes our Christian life. And they're going to have some insightful things to say to us this morning. And as we start exploring this chapter, I do want to tell you that we could spend a whole lot of weeks on just this chapter. It is just so rich. But Pastor John insisted that I edit down my original 32-page message so that we still wouldn't be sitting here next Sunday morning. All right, let's dig in. Hebrews 12, 1 through 4. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The first nugget this morning is that it is so important that we realize we do not race alone. The writer references the crowd of witnesses or cloud of witnesses from the Old Testament that were listed in chapter 11. And as we look back at the Old Testament, there is a story in Exodus chapter 18 about how the Israelites came to Moses to settle their disputes. During this mediation, Moses would explain and teach about the statutes of God and his laws. These sessions took all day. They would start early in the morning and they would go on all day into the evening. Moses' father-in-law watched this, and he called Moses aside and said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." So let's hear from Kim.
Another thing that I love about thinking of as a race is that if you look at the top runners, rarely are they ever running alone. They are in a pack with people in front of and behind them. Sure, someone might be leading the pack, but through the duration of the race, that often changes. One of the two surest ways to make sure you run your farthest is to run with people around you. Other people doing exactly what you're doing with the same mindset and the same goals. It helps push you further than you could go by yourself.
So Kim says that you need to run with people around you, a pack. Do you run in a pack? Our independent Western mindset does not teach us to do this really well. Running a race together with others doing exactly what we need to be doing with the same mindset and goals, it does help push us farther than we could go by ourselves. And if you've ever been cheered on by your family or friends, you know this to be true. John Donne wrote in a poem, "No man is an island. We need the pack." Now, Joe and Kim do not know each other, but Joe offered a similar perspective as Kim. Joe said, experiencing training with others is huge. You learn more about them and yourself and create a bond that shows you aren't the only one dealing with struggles, especially as an amputee. Our coach always tells us to race each other because we make each other better. When athletes train together, they form a bond. When we train together as Christians, we form a bond. When we study the Word, when we share our struggles and pray for one another, when we simply just enjoy each other's company and friendships, we are running our life race together. We make each other better. At least we can make each other better. Church, just like athletes need the pack, we all need a pack. Our church hope is a pack. We can and do run together here. And as we run, we fix our eyes on Christ. Every year in church, we celebrate Palm Sunday like we did this morning. We commemorate and we remember when Christ rode into Jerusalem on the donkey before Passover at the start of the last week of his human life. So let's look at Christ as he got himself and his disciples ready to approach Jerusalem, where he would claim his rightful place as the prophesied Messiah. It's important to realize that he knew exactly what was ahead for him. From Luke 18, taking the 12, he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him. And on the third day, he will rise." Christ knew he was going to suffer. Hebrews 12, verses 3 and 4 connect us to that suffering. "Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood." Well, when did Christ shed blood as a resistance to sin? Well, Christ took his disciples, he took his pack with him at night to the Garden of Gethsemane at the end of the week after riding into Jerusalem, and they went to pray. While praying, Jesus cried out to God, asking if there is any way to take this cup, if there is any way to save mankind without this suffering and death, would you please do that? He was in such distress that he cried loudly and with many tears. Luke 22:44 tells us that his body was so stressed that he sweat drops of blood. The capillaries of his body were breaking apart. And as Krishan reminded us earlier in this series, God's answer to Jesus' request to save the world another way was no. There was no other way to save mankind from sin. Jesus was the only sinless person who could fulfill the prophecies and become the sin of the world. And so Jesus obeyed. He did not rebel against the Father. That would have been sin. He obeyed. We cannot comprehend the depths of suffering that Jesus endured. His pack fell asleep, and they didn't support him as he prayed in anguish in the garden. And then Judas, as we read, one of his pack, betrayed Jesus by identifying him and handing him over to the soldiers. The physical tortures Jesus would then suffer, being mistreated, verbally abused, whipped, beaten, and then the humiliation of being nailed to a piece of wood, naked and exposed, the horrible agony of suffocating on that upright cross. And beyond all the torturous mental, emotional, and physical suffering, if that wasn't enough, Scripture tells us that Jesus became our sin. 2 Corinthians 5 tells us, "For our sake, God made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Jesus we might become the righteousness of God." If you imagine all the evil on this planet, from the first sin of Adam and Eve, through every sin and atrocity that's been committed by people who lived before Christ, and everyone who then lives after Christ, he didn't just carry the sin, he became their sin. That makes my brain hurt because I find it so hard to grasp how Jesus became the sin of the world. But he did. And in that moment, God his Father separated himself from his Son. There's a song we sing that says, "The Father turned his face away." And Jesus cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Hebrews 12:2 addresses something really important. It says that Jesus, for the sake of the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despised the shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. So what was the joy sent before him? What was the prize Jesus was going to get for running this race and enduring? 2 Corinthians 5:21, we just read it. "For our sake, God made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Jesus we might become the righteousness of God." Part of the joy and reward for Jesus is that he would make us the righteousness of God. Hebrews 5 tells us that although Jesus was a son, and this is important because it's going to come up in a little bit, Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. There is so much here. Christ's joy lay in what he knew would come after his suffering. His suffering work would banish the power of sin. It would destroy death. It would reconcile people, his church, whom he calls his bride, to God. He became the eternal source of salvation. That was and is his prize. We, the church, are his prize. You and I, beloved ones, we are his prize. Ephesians 5:26 and 27, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, so as to present the church to himself in splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything of that kind, so that we, the church, may be holy and without blemish. Beloved, we belong to God. We are Christ's bride, and we are God's legitimate children. Verse 5 says, "Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the ones he loves, and he chastises every son whom he receives." Now, ladies, I have a special message just for you. Did you know, women, that we too are sons of God? The Westminster Shorter Confession, question 34, asks this: what is adoption? And the answer is, adoption is that act of God's free grace by which we become his sons with all the privileges of being his. Galatians 3 and Romans 8 tells us that we are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. All who are being led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. We have received a spirit of adoption as sons and are heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. So this example of being sons applies to all of us who believe in Jesus, regardless of our gender. Our Hebrew text goes on to describe how God treats his sons by using the example of how earthly fathers or parents ideally treat their children by lovingly training and teaching them. And I just want to give a side note here. If you have or had a painful relationship with a parent, especially your father, it may not be comforting to you to hear about God disciplining you like an earthly parent does, because your father or your mother may have been unkind or abusive to you, or maybe they were just absent. But God is the perfect parent with perfect motives. So I invite you to imagine the experience having a loving parent training and teaching you. That is our example here. And then secondly, if you have been or are a parent, you know that parents really don't discipline or train other people's kids with the same investment that is made into your own. We devote ourselves to those in our household. We don't necessarily pay for the neighborhood kids' college fund. We don't necessarily ask to see the babysitter's report card. We love and care about other people's kids, but it's not the same as how we love and care for our own. So it says in our text that one of the ways we know we are legitimately God's children is because God doesn't leave us to fend for ourselves. He trains us. He teaches us. He corrects us. Because when we get a little sassy and perhaps a little too big for our britches, he chastises us because he loves us perfectly. He works all things for the good, not that all things are good, but he works all things for the ultimate good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And that's from the book of Romans. Now we're going to skip verses a little bit. We're going to start with verse 7, and then we're going to grab hold of verses 10 and 11. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, for they, our earthly parents, disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But God disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. God invests into us by growing us, sanctifying us. God takes us from start to finish in this process of maturing us. His end goal is for us to share in his righteousness, so that our lives reflect his righteousness, so that others can see his righteousness in our lives. And the end result of all this training and disciplining and correcting is that it brings us peace. The fruit we bear, if we let ourselves be trained by our perfect, loving God, is peace. Joe has this to say: having an experienced coach that you trust means you have someone invested in you as an athlete and wants you to succeed. You don't know everything, and every perspective can be valuable, but you have to trust those corrections are meant to help you, and then put in your best effort to match their corrections. So you notice what he's saying here, that athletes still have to do the work. As Joe said, coaches are invested in you, but you have to trust that the correction they're giving is to help you. And then you must put in your best effort to accept those corrections and change. This is the same with the Lord. Do we trust that his corrections are being done to help us? And do we put in our best effort to receive his correction and to match or to live out our lives so that we are meeting that correction? Now, Kim also has some insights about being a coach for others and receiving correction.
My favorite thing about being reminded of the coaching relationship is that whenever things are tough for my athletes or myself in sport, it is on purpose. Not to say that everything negative in life is a purposeful thing from God, but when I place additional stress, additional weight, additional distances on my athletes, or they're placed on me, it is for two reasons only. One, to prepare me for something tough I have in the future, or two, as almost a reward for how strong or fast myself or the athlete has gotten. And to get that lens and thinking of our relationship with Jesus as preparing for a race or running for a race, it can reframe all the hard work or hard things in life. Instead of thinking that, oh no, this thing happened to me, it can be flipped to how are God and I preparing for something else? Or how is God showing me how much I've grown in this? Or how can I grow through this? And it removes that negative, oppressive, and punishment lens from God and replaces it as one coming from love.
Reframing our perspective on God's training in our lives is powerful. Back in verse 1, we were encouraged to lay aside every weight and run with endurance. Verse 12 says, therefore, lift your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to receive the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. That no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. Do you see the connection to the direction we were given to remove or let go of the weights that hinder our race? So here are some of my ideas about how these might connect. In the verses we just read, lift your drooping hands. Do we have hands that do not lift up to serve others? Strengthen weak knees. Do we have weak knees that do not bow in humility to others? We are called to make straight paths for our feet. Do we wobble all aimlessly in our life? Or do we approach our lives purposefully, intentionally, with the goal to proactively heal what is lame or broken within us? Do we purposefully censor and control our own behavior, our speech or activities that don't bring peace to those around us? Verse 15 calls us to live a life that intentionally gives grace to others so that they can see and receive God's grace. And are we honestly dealing with our negative emotions and our negative thoughts so that bitterness doesn't take root in our hearts? Because that bitter spirit, it ends up hurting other people. There is so much here in this chapter. But church, let's not cling to the weights that actually drag us down because we justify them as not really being sin. Let's not walk close to the line of sin without stepping over the line. We're being encouraged here to run our race as far away from sin as we can get and to lay aside and get rid of the things that weigh us down and hinder us from running this race that we have been given to run. So what's in store for us? What's our reward at the end of our race? Well, we have an eternal hope in an unshakable kingdom. Verse 18 says, "You have not come to what may be touched a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words make the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble, I shake with fear. These words were written to people of the Jewish lineage and religious faith. What the writer describes is the experience Israel had at Mount Sinai. This account is recorded in Exodus 19 and 20, and the scene described here is just before God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. The people of Israel were gathered at the foot of a mountain that, as we heard, was frankly terrifying. The threat of death, smoke, fire, earthquakes, a trumpet-like sound that hurt their ears, that was their experience with the presence of God. But that's not what we have ahead of us. Verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn, that's Jesus, who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, that's us in Jesus, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. Now we're going to skip to verse 28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. While we are here on earth, this unshakable kingdom is within us, within the presence of the Holy Spirit who is given to all believers. But in the future, someday, we will be in the city of the living God, where Revelation 21 tells us that the Lamb Christ is the lamp and there's no sun because God's glory is enough light. We will be with angels in festal gathering. Those are celebrations. Those are parties. We will be with everyone who followed Christ, and we will be with Jesus in an unshakable, unmovable, indestructible, eternal kingdom. Beloved church, our takeaways this morning: you cannot race alone. You need the pack. We fix our eyes on Christ. He showed us how to run, and He is our prize. We belong to God. We are dearly loved, legitimate sons. And we have eternal hope in an unshakable kingdom. The Apostle John writes in Revelation 21, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who is seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. This is our reward. This is why we endure. This is why we do life together, why we cheer each other on as we throw off the things that slow us down. We help each other filter out the distractions. We hold one another up. We race in a pack to push us farther than we can go by ourselves, to keep our eye on the prize of Christ, because someday we will be with him together in eternal glory.